Professor Anthony Pym is a longtime friend of the Nida School and the Nida Institute. He has been an ally and a conversation partner, I think, as we have been trying to navigate our own work in translation studies to define what we're doing. And I'm delighted to introduce him. He is Professor of Translation and Intercultural Studies and coordinator of the Intercultural Studies group at Rovira y Virgili University in Tarragona, Spain. He runs a doctoral program in translation and intercultural studies. He's also president of the European Society for Translation Studies, a fellow of the Catalan Institution for Research and Advanced Studies, and visiting researcher at the Monterrey Institute of International Studies. He's the author of, and here I'll pick a few of the books that I know best and have been instructive for me. Most recently, Exploring Translation Theories, The Moving Text, 2004, Negotiating the Frontier in 2000, and Method in Translation History, 1998. And I can't avoid mentioning, or I won't, the English translation of his French book on ethics, which is hopefully forthcoming, with the title On Translator Ethics. Please join me in welcoming Professor Anthony Pym.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much for that introduction. Good morning to you all. I'm pleased to come here, actually from Monterey at the moment, in California, but also not representing, not speaking on behalf as, but as a person coming from European translation studies, looking for points of contact and interaction with people from the American academic community interested in translation, and also people interested particularly in Bible translation, that is, in the Nida Institute in particular, with the Nida School for Translation Studies as being one source of mediation between these at least three different communities. I have a written paper, but I'm going to speak to it, which might create problems for the criticisms I'm going to receive on the basis of a written paper, but I assure you it will be exactly the same meanings that are going to be put forward. The basic reason for the changes are recent events, not the least of which is the passing of Eugene Nida on the 25th of August in Madrid. And I feel the need, it's very appropriate here, to pay homage to Eugene Nida, who did so much to open the intellectual space within which we work in translation studies in Europe, in the United States, and in all the communities that are involved in here. As I've had occasion to point out in other talks and papers, for me, the main contribution of Eugene Nida wasn't particularly as the founder or father or promoter of dynamic equivalence. It was to open this space in which there was one polarity, one kind of work that translators could do for a particular kind of translation, for particular kinds of communities, but there was also always formal correspondence, previously formal equivalents, traveling with it. Nida's intellectual work for me was not just as a linguist, as a scholar of Greek, as a promoter, a tireless promoter of his ideas, as a brilliant writer, as somebody who could write about translation with a multitude of examples and illustrations from numerous cultures, numerous languages. It was the fact that he opened a space for discussion and debate and exploration that didn't exist prior to him, I think. Prior to Nida, we have more or less opinions and people with a lot of certitude that what they're doing is the right thing. With Nida, since Nida, we've had a far wider space for debate and exchange. And I'm personally very, very appreciative of that. I became particularly appreciative of Nida's work when I realized the impact it's had not just what, in evangelical circles and those kinds of missionary activities that he was involved in, but in the translation policies of the Vatican, of the Catholic Church, which is a topic that has been of interest to me in recent times. And I was so surprised, to tell you the truth, to get back to the early, very clear translation policy, 1969, known as Comme le prévoit, and to find that the basic points that Eugene Nida is certainly not mentioned, equivalence is not mentioned, dynamic equivalence is not mentioned, but the points raised there are pure Eugene Nida dynamic equivalence. And this was a tremendous surprise to me, the fact that a bit of activism is fine, and with Spanish, even better for me, because I work in Spain and on that particular language, but to have that tremendous influence on the fundamental policy of the big church is quite something. I read from the Comme le prévoit. It's not sufficient that a liturgical translation merely reproduce the expressions and ideas of the original text. Okay. Rather, it must faithfully communicate to a given people and their own language that which the Church, by means of this given text, originally intended to communicate. There you have the dynamic equivalent, idealism. A faithful translation, therefore, cannot be judged on the basis of individual words. The total context of this specific act of communication must be kept in mind, as well as the literary form proper to the respective language, where the respective language is the target language, and the rights and priorities of that language, and by extension culture, enter into the fray as a dominating force. This seems to me very radical to read even now, coming from the Vatican. Further, to discover the true meaning of a text, the translator must follow the scientific methods of textual study as used by experts. And the experts, not necessarily theologians, not necessarily believers. They can be linguists and anthropologists and people who know about cultures and who know about communication. And that role of science and expertise from beyond the church is open there and was closed rather quickly, as we'll see. Further, it's allowed in Comme le prévoit that the translations should be established by mixed commissions. That is, people from the church who know the text and people from the target culture, as we would call it with Nida, who are involved in expressing and putting forward their own preferences and priorities. Authorization would then be by the established church, but those mixed commissions were an important and radical institution put forward in the wake of Nida and expressed by the Vatican in 1969. Here I recount my encounter with the Vatican on the 18th of August 2011. This is something out of Chartreuse de Parme, I think, where the hero walks through the Battle of Waterloo. I happened to be in Madrid to get a visa to come here, and I was in the middle of about 1.5 million young Catholics having a great time. Now, 1.5 million young people of whatever persuasion will have a great time in Spain in summer. So it's not particularly the praise of the Catholic Church that they were having such fun, but it really was quite a spectacle, and we had the full range of what the Catholic Church is on display. The Pope was indeed there, as indeed were the Sisters of Charity, as indeed were extremely right-wing looking fellows with chains for belts and jackboots on, doing what kind of work I don't know, to a visitor wandering through this battlefield, because there was also the Madrid equivalent of the Social Forum, I guess, the indignados, who were protesting against the 1.5 million Catholic young people there. And then I saw 3 buses full of bishops go past, and they were waving. I thought, do you think... Anyway. What a thing is the Catholic Church. This extremely diverse institution that could somehow hold together with a central image. You had these 1.5 million, I don't know, perhaps not the 1.5 million, but chanting as you would at a football match. Benedicto, and Ratzinger feeling quite embarrassed in his lovely white robe and lovely red shoes, having become a football star. But it worked. This institution remarkably does hold together despite enormous internal diversity. And I came away with just one message: don't mock the Catholic Church. You know, they are dealing with some very, very profound internal problems and dealing with it in their own way on a media level that is perhaps something that I shouldn't hope to find expressed in their translation policies. It is, however, expressed in their translation policies. 1969 was Comme le Prévoit. Little by little, that radical Nida-inspired attitude towards translation has been done away with, to the point where the current translation policy is almost the opposite of what we have just read. For reasons, I imagine, of having to hold together an extremely diverse institution, like a multinational company that sees its subsidiaries threatening to head off in their individual directions. Now, the main instrument by which that original translation policy has been undone is, it seems to me, the concept of inculturation, inculturation, legitimized from 1985 by John Paul II, and described as, what is inculturation? The incarnation of the gospel in autonomous cultures, and at the same time the introduction of these cultures into the life of the Church. So we have a system where, or a process whereby the central system, the Church, incorporates itself into the cultures, and the cultures incorporate themselves into the Church, and you become bigger. Hence, inculturation, I would surmise etymologically. Now, just by its very conceptual geometry, this system that becomes bigger contradicts the original thought that we find in theories of equivalence, and certainly in Eugene Nida, of source text, target text, source culture, target culture, of having 2 cultures. Instead of having 2 cultures and thinking about translation in this way, the notion of inculturation has translation operating within the one system, which is growing bigger. And I really had to pause when I read that and wait a minute. Translation doesn't work that way, does it? In the important policy statement, Varietatis Legitime, 1994, we find examples of inculturation, which make a lot of sense. From that text, we have the process of inculturation throughout the history of salvation. The people of Israel, throughout its history, preserved the certain knowledge that it was a chosen people of God, the witness of his action and love in the midst of the nations. It took from neighboring peoples certain forms of worship, but its faith in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob subjected these borrowings to profound modifications. So you go back to the origins, and you certainly can see inculturation happening there, so says the text. Then, the encounter between the Jewish world and Greek wisdom gave rise to a new form of inculturation. The translation of the Bible into Greek introduced the Word of God into a world that had been closed to it, and caused, under divine inspiration, which can justify a lot of things, an enrichment of the Scriptures, and so on. The Church as a culture, as a system, recounts its own history as a process of inculturation, of successively taking in from outside cultures and becoming larger thanks to that form of ingestion. All the while maintaining some form of identity under divine inspiration. Now, the notion of that identity, of that selfness and samehood, is not actually spelt out other than by references to faith and inspiration, the hope that we are the same or they are the same throughout these successive processes of inculturation. What is strange, though, if you look at that text as a frame for translation, which is indeed the way it mentions translation as operating as one of the instruments of inculturation, looking at that text, one is surprised to see the discussion of interaction between cultures without any presence or voice or consideration of the cultural other. There is only discussion of the one cultural system growing larger by taking in other cultural systems, but those other, what we would call, in other terms, the target culture, target text, have absolutely no voice or consideration in this process. They are supposed to be enriched themselves and enlightened by divine inspiration and faith, and they should like that, and that's good enough for them, so let's get on with the business of incorporating them into the empire. It was indeed a Holy Roman Empire to go along with the process of inculturation. The notion of inculturation meets translation proper, and you can see how it becomes key in undoing that dynamic equivalence, which gives an enormous voice to that target source culture, the cultural other, which has to be respected, to where we have to get the linguist and the anthropologist to tell us about this cultural other. Suddenly that otherness is of very limited consequence. In the 2001 doctrine, instruction, Liturgiam Authenticum, even the names tell you how much the mode of thought has been changing over the years. So we've gone from 1969, really dynamic equivalence, if we want to give it that name. From 1985, we have the concept of inculturation, which is elaborated and presented as an instruction in 1994. And then in 2001, the instruction Liturgiam Authenticum. Here, there is remarkably little prospect for self-transformation. I read from the text, "It may be affirmed that the Roman rite is itself, the Roman rite, the established liturgy established by the Vatican, is itself a precious example and an instrument of true inculturation. This characteristic is particularly evident in its orations, which exhibit a capacity to transcend the limits of their original situation so as to become the prayers of Christians in any time or place. I apologize for preaching to the converted, the theologians among you. This is your bread and butter. But in this very appeal to transcendence from the moment of production, we no longer have the figure of intention. We no longer have the pretense to communicating what was intended in the original utterance. In fact, we've got rid of the original utterance. It has been elevated through divine inspiration to a universal utterance. The Roman rite, established and fixed by the institution, is now good enough for all and forever. Translation then becomes a rather easy, simple process, entirely internal to the one cultural system. I continue. In preparing all translations of the liturgical books, the greatest care is to be taken to maintain the identity, here is your identity, and unitary expression of the Roman rite, not as a sort of historical monument, but rather as a manifestation of the theological realities of ecclesial communion and unity. The work of inculturation, of which the translation into vernacular languages is a part, is not therefore to be considered an avenue for the creation of new varieties or families of rites. You can see here why I was amazed at how Benedicto managed to hold this diverse institution together. It's through central imposition of a central model, the Roman Rite in Latin, and that's what you translate, and you translate as closely as possible to that text. It should be recognized that any adaptations introduced out of cultural or pastoral necessity thereby become part of the Roman Rite and are to be inserted into it in a harmonious way, and that harmony must predominate. Do we need outside help for this process, as we did in the 1969 doctrine, as Eugene Nida would with his appeals to science, to linguistics in particular? Liturgiam Authenticum says, while it is useful with the assistance of historical and other scientific tools to consult a source that may have been discovered for the same text, Dead Sea Scrolls, something like that, nevertheless, it is always the text of the Latin Editio Typica itself that is to be translated. So you can do whatever you like with whatever linguistic discoveries you might have made or anthropological interpretations. It doesn't matter, because there was no original utterance or situation of originality. We have established the text, and that's what you translate, and we will establish what the meaning of that text is. Inculturation here has become almost the dead opposite, I think, of what dynamic equivalence was in the 1969 instruction. Now, this is obviously considered in Nida terms. Reactionary, in a very technical sense, reacting against the previous doctrine, which probably led people to go to places that the central authority thought it could not control. But also of contemporary importance within debates within the Catholic Church, to an extent that I have found surprising. And some of you may as well. In the debates about this current doctrine, it's of extreme importance to people in the Church what we, academics, people doing translation studies, say about Eugene Nida and dynamic equivalence. I've been going around blogs and contributing to blogs and getting feedback to my contributions from all these people who say, but academics no longer believe in dynamic equivalence. There's been the reaction away from Eugene Nida. We can cite Lawrence Venuti and the appeal to foreignization, to sticking to the actual text. Therefore, we academics, secular academics, are being conscripted into an argument in favor of this particular translation policy. And I actually wrote a text to say, hey, wait a minute. When we're arguing, we could cite Antoine Berman or Lawrence Venuti, you can look at the work of Gayatri Spivak. When we're doing this, we're not particularly in favor of this doctrine, but we are automatically conscripted into it. Hence my article, which did try to say, well, Eugene Nida was there to open a space for debate and consideration. And there were always many different ways to translating. And academic work on translation is not, when all said and done, a pendulum which says, we were right at the dynamic end now, and we're going back to the formal end here, and in 10 years' time we'll be back the other side. What's been happening is, in fact, that our debates have got wider and wider, moving away from the linguistic features of the text to consideration of the translators involved, the different cultures involved and the different cultural effects involved in, I think, a fairly widespread appreciation of the diversity of the results and practices involved. Yet I can understand why the critiques of Nida would be conscripted in that way. If you look at the theory of localization, people doing localization at a company will have two basic policies. It can localize, advertising agencies if you like. You can localize your message into each particular culture, or adopt standardization is the name, and have the one standard message which is sent out, and the cultures will change. The tendency in international localization, as it's misnamed, is towards standardization. Companies are finding that it's more beneficial to go out and change the cultures rather than change your message. The model of inculturation, as I proceed with this mode of thought, becomes something that I can apply to many other systems beyond that of the Catholic Church. Some years ago, I was working on the history of translators in what's now called Spain, particularly the 12th century, which is known as the School of Toledo, which was, for me, I was studying the interface between Islam and Christianity. It's when Greek knowledge, which had been passed through Syriac, went from Arabic into Latin, and then in the 13th century into Romance.